last time. Relax, have a drink with me one last time. Let's take a break tonight, and then we'll teach them how to say goodbye. To say goodbye, you and I. No, sir. One last time. The people will hear from me one last time. And if we get this right, we're gonna teach them how to say goodbye. You and I.
All right, folks, welcome back one more time. This is indeed the last lecture that we're going to have about an assigned class text, but I want to remind you, there is actually going to be one last video about the final paper project and how to do it. And obviously it behooves you to watch that video. There is nothing that we've done all semester that is not part of the final paper project. In other words, I don't want you to somehow discard all the skills we've learned about answering opponents and quoting text from cases in order to look at the tests and the standards in those cases. I don't want you to forget any of that stuff. Everything we've done this whole semester is part of the final paper project, but there's a little bit more as well that we're going to do with that final paper project. So be sure to tune in for that video. Very important for you completing the final paper and doing quite well at it, as I know you will. But now we need to finish up with Jeremy Waldron. You'll remember we ended the last video asking, what is Waldron's conception of democracy such that he's really just not that scared of tyranny of the majority? What is his idea of rights such that he's just really not scared that majorities often trample rights? Okay, so in this video, I'm going to use some text from Waldron, but also a lot of examples and hypotheticals to illustrate his overall point. So let's start with sort of a hypothetical. What if the actual dispute carried out in a legislature is over the question whether some purported right exists at all? Remember in that vision of the tyranny of the majority that I laid out for you in that last lecture, what we were afraid of was that the majority used their preferences or their self-interest to override the rights of the minority. But what if that's not the question? What if there's actually legitimate and valid disagreement about whether some purported right exists at all? So the legislators, in good faith, discuss the policy in question, and they discuss whether there exists a right which would trump the policy. The majority decides, after consideration, that the purported right just isn't plausible, either because they can see no reason why a right to X exists, which is obviously sometimes a legitimate position to take. You take positions all the time in your life that certain rights just don't exist. Or the majority decides that this supposed right isn't plausible because some otherwise agreed upon right, which is listed, say, in a Bill of Rights, just doesn't apply in this situation. That is, they interpret some settled constitutional provision just not to apply in the instance that they are considering. But the minority persist in their claim that they have this right. Now, they could just be pressing their claim forward because they lost the policy battle, ended up losing money or some policy preferences because of it. They'd rather not see this policy enacted for certain self-interested reasons. It's possible. And they could just be using the notion of rights as trumps just to win this battle, but now fought again at the level of the courts. That's always a possibility. But even if we assume that the minority, in good faith, still believes that the purported right exists, either because they have a specific right to X, or because they believe that a settled constitutional provision should apply in this case, Waldron still questions the use of courts to enforce this right. Because in the situation I just laid out for you, the question becomes not one of should the court step in to trump the passionate and perhaps oppressive majority that is being tyrannous, but instead the question becomes, should the court step in to settle this good faith dispute over the meaning of rights in favor of the minority's good faith interpretation of their own rights, trumping the majority's good faith interpretation of rights as well? Waldron is asking, why think that courts are the right place to decide disputes between two equally good faith understandings of rights. Even Dworkin has to recognize that these same types of good faith disputes will occur even between judges. So then Waldron is asking, well, why let the judges decide the very same question that the legislature had decided and simply opt for a different answer? Now, even if we believe that the situation I just laid out for you of good faith understandings in the legislature is possible, there will, of course, be instances that come before a court which are clear cut. Think of the civil rights struggle of African Americans, and especially the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in America. There isn't any way, and there was never any way, to think of laws that kept Blacks from voting or using public facilities and etc. as good faith understandings on the part of the white majority that Blacks just did not possess these rights. But Waldron wants to point out not all cases, and indeed very few cases, are as clear-cut as these. And when they're not clear-cut, we have to assume that people have acted in good faith. So why let a simple majority of the court decide using the same criteria, the same arguments about rights that the legislature had used? They consider the very same things. It's really frequently the case that the court is weighing two good faith understandings of rights against each other, and in a closely divided split of 5-4, some of them lump for one understanding of rights, while the others lump for another understanding of rights. And they write these angry opinions against each other, saying how the other side is just terribly wrong, couldn't possibly have been right about the case or about the law applied, and so on and so forth. But in reality, when you read about the case in the newspaper, you think to yourself, well, heck, that case could have gone either way. Good faith understandings on both sides. So I urge you to take a case like that, maybe one that we've studied in our own course, and take a look at the legislative record of debates over the law that was in question in that case. Frequently, in fact, almost always, you find that the legislators are arguing about the very same good faith understandings of rights. And they're doing it with just as much passion and just as much intelligence, and they're deciding by a majority vote. Well, hell, that's just what the court does. So why privilege the court's decision over the legislature's? Isn't the majority vote of the legislature on the same issues just as likely to be right as the majority vote of the court? And there, obviously, I'm paraphrasing John Stuart Mill on votes with respect to social morality. Or to challenge your preconceptions even more, Waldron wants to say, isn't the majority vote of the legislature more likely to be right than the majority vote of the court? If any of you know Condorcet's jury theorem, you might think legislatures are definitely more likely to be correct. The jury theorem basically states that if you take a body of voters, each of whom has even a little bit more than a 50% chance of getting an issue right, so take, for instance, the guilt or innocence of a defendant, which could be true or untrue, so there is a right answer, the majority of that body, the theorem says, is more likely to be right the larger the body of voters is. Indeed, in a body that's large enough, even though each person's odds of getting the answer correct are only a little bit better than a coin flip, the odds that a majority of this very large body gets the answer right comes pretty darn close to 100%. And to tell you the truth, the size of the group voting on this doesn't have to grow too large before the odds of being correct become about 100%. So given that, if we're going to use majority votes to decide good faith questions of rights, shouldn't we use the majority votes of the biggest bodies that we have available to us, legislatures? Why choose a 9-member court over a 435-member legislative body? Now, as I already said, and I've repeated many times here, Waldron's whole argument here is premised on the idea that legislatures engage in good faith efforts to get it right on questions of rights. If legislators in the majority are acting in bad faith, either without regard to the rights of minorities or with positive contempt for the rights of minorities, I want to repeat that even Waldron says that courts may then be necessary to step in as a sort of backstop. Here, in those instances, it would surely be right to say that the political insulation of courts makes them at least somewhat more desirable than legislatures to deal with such questions to put a stop to bad faith laws. Since federal judges don't face re-election fights, And I'll just remind you here one more time, many state judges are elected, do face re-election fights, but federal judges are insulated somewhat from the sort of storms of passion which might push legislators to act in bad faith. But look, let's not exaggerate things here. Let's not get lost in a world of theory. Even if judges don't have to answer to voters who might themselves be overly passionate, self-interested, and prone at times to disregard the rights of minorities, judges can be pretty amazingly wrong-headed all by themselves, thank you very much. Okay, sure, our fear of tyranny of the majority isn't just plain wrong. Legislative majorities may make terrible, unjust, oppressive decisions. But courts, Waldron wants to remind you, can make egregiously unjust decisions as well. Take a look at his argument that starts on page 247. Think of Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857, which extended slavery as a legal practice in the United States. The Missouri Compromise, you might remember from your history books, had excluded slavery from the US territories in the West. That is, a legislature had decided to do something that you would surely think is right. But the Supreme Court reversed this, calling the compromise unconstitutional, and even going so far as to say, in the language of the time, that no Negroes, not even free Negroes, could ever become citizens of the United States. They were, the court said, beings of an inferior order, not included in the phrase all men in the Declaration of Independence, nor afforded any rights by the Constitution. The legislature, in this instance, got it right. The court got it wrong. Or think of Lochner versus New York in 1905, which we recently studied. That actually extended inequality by putting workers more under the control of their bosses. States all over the country during what's called the Progressive Era were passing minimum wage laws, maximum hour laws, and other labor legislation. But the court overturned them, ignoring the issue of whether the freedom of workers was in some ways enhanced by these laws that the states had passed, and using what we've seen as a sort of tendentious theory of the Constitution to decide that these laws limited the, quote, freedom of contract of bosses and of laborers just too much. The Lochner case overturned a 60-hour per week law, as I've said before, not even the 40-hour per week law of the sort we're accustomed to. They overturned a 60-hour per week law saying that everyone should be free to work as long as they want, if they want. But the practical effect of this was that bosses could now demand 80 or even 100-hour weeks, and that workers couldn't refuse or else they'd be fired. So as a lot of later commentators came to decide, right, that freedom of contract is maybe not really a freedom at all. And the Lochner decision, the reasoning in the Lochner decision, came to be roundly rejected by constitutional scholars. Now, therefore, some people might think the legislatures around the country got it right when it came to labor legislation, and the court got it wrong. And Waldron wants to remind you, when legislatures get it wrong, it's not always, and really, it's not often, that the court is there to correct their mistakes. So think of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which allowed Louisiana's law segregating train cars under the assumption that separate but equal facilities were actually equal. Or think of Hirabayashi and Korematsu in the 1940s, which allowed the military to round up Japanese American citizens whose loyalty to the country was unquestioned and to place them in detention camps. In these cases, parts of our government made decisions which we, in retrospect, have come to think of as egregiously wrong, but the Supreme Court just rubber-stamped them. There are a few bright, shining examples of courts getting it right and halting tyrannical majorities. So Brown versus Board of Education reversed that Plessy decision, and in doing so, it reversed the practice of school segregation, which had been legislatively approved in some parts of the country. Loving versus Virginia might be another example. It struck down miscegenation laws, that is, laws banning interracial marriages. But even in that case, there were very few states left remaining that even had such laws, fewer still that enforced them. Indeed, as much role as the common stories give to the Supreme Court in protecting liberties, Waldron wants to say an equally convincing, maybe a more convincing story can be told about the ways in which American legislatures have worked, perhaps slowly and perhaps over time, to extend rights. State legislatures, for instance, got rid of their own miscegenation laws. It was Congress that eventually apologized for Japanese American internment and wiped the law clean of those stains of Hirabayashi and Korematsu. And it took a massive legislative effort by Roosevelt and Congress during the New Deal, and even, as you know, a plan to pack the court so as to try to stop it from blocking labor legislation like it had in Lochner. It took all of that political effort to end the Lochner era. And hey, let me state the obvious here. Slavery wasn't ended by courts. There was a war, and then legislatively approved amendments to the Constitution. To someone like Waldron, it's the unfolding of democratic egalitarian principles through our legislatures which has worked to extend rights in United States history. Principles of equal citizenship, equal concern for each other's material well-being, equal respect for each other's values and choices. All the things that Dworkin says that he cares about, these have been played out in our legislatures, Waldron is saying, where democratic equality is on display every single day, where the very least citizen in the country has theoretically as much ability to petition his government, to vote, to organize and lobby as any other citizen has. And the more this principle has played itself out, the more our legislatures have seen that they could not limit equal citizenship to just a few. And legislatures have extended equal rights, both democratic political rights and civil rights like freedom of religion and etc., to working men, to women, to African Americans, and of course the list goes on. And yes, despite what you might think, it was legislatures that extended the franchise to African Americans. Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Congress appropriated the money to enforce it. And in that act, Congress even directed the Attorney General to bring cases to the courts challenging the constitutionality of things like poll taxes. Or, in other words, even when the Supreme Court finally got involved and struck down poll taxes in 1966 in a case called Harper versus Virginia, it was because Congress had gotten the ball rolling on that case. And this is perhaps why Waldron's conclusion is best stated by one of the lines that begins his essay. He says on page 232, "Participation is a right whose exercise seems peculiarly appropriate in situations where reasonable rights bearers disagree about what rights they have." All right, so that's it, folks. You've seen the Dworkin versus Waldron debate, and that is our final lecture video on an assigned text of the semester. I really look forward to speaking about this debate with you in class because this debate may actually form the backbone of your final paper if you wish it to. So let's get together and talk about it. I'll see you then.